Well, good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you all to CSIS in this afternoon's event. This is part of the project on military and diplomatic history. I'm Mark Hansen. I'm the interim director of the project. And the purpose of the project is to bring in distinguished historians to talk about their issues and the kinds of things that they're working on to increase the visibility of these kinds of history, military and diplomatic, which visibility these days as they deserve. Before we move on to our speaker, I have to make one administrative announcement, and that is that in the unlikely event of an emergency, I'll instruct you what to do. We'll either evacuate to the front or the back. And with that cheerful note, I'm going to turn things over to our moderator, Jake Barnett, introduce our speaker and our panelists.
Thank you, Mark. Hello, thank you all for coming out today. My name is Jake Barnett. I'm a researcher at the Hudson Institute. I'm not quite as distinguished a speaker as my other panelists, so I think without further ado, I'm just going to introduce them and we'll get this fascinating discussion going. So our guest speaker today is Alexander Thurston. Dr. Thurston is an assistant professor of African Studies at Georgetown University. He is a scholar of religion with a particular focus on Islam and politics in Africa. And prior to joining Georgetown's faculty, he was a 2013 to 2014 International Affairs Fellow with the Council on Foreign Relations. His first book, which was published in 2016, is called Salafism in Nigeria, Islam, Politics, and Preaching. And it offers a detailed look into some of the leading figures in Nigeria's Salafist movement, including many individuals in Borno State who played a role in the rise of Boko Haram, as I'm sure we'll be discussing today. And of course, we'll be discussing his second book today, Boko Haram, The History of an African Jihadist Movement. It was released last November, and as Mark mentioned, copies will be for sale outside after the event. Then at the end here, we have Jennifer Cooke. She is the director of the CSIS Africa program, where she leads research and analysis on political, economic, and security dynamics in Africa. She's a frequent commentator in print, on radio, and on television, and she has testified before Congress on Boko Haram in Nigeria, as well as such subjects as the political crisis in Cote d'Ivoire and the African Union. She travels widely in Africa and has been an election observer in Sierra Leone, Mali, Nigeria, and Ghana. Prior to joining CSIS, she worked at the National Academy of Sciences in the Office of Human Rights and the Office of News and Public Information, and in the U.S. Congress on the House Subcommittee on Africa. And then right here to my left, we have Alice Hunt Friend. She is a senior fellow in the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and she focuses on civil-military relations and African security issues. From 2012 to 2014, she was the principal director for African Affairs in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, where she focused primarily on North and West African counterterrorism policy. She joined the Department of Defense in 2009 as Special Assistant to the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and also served as the senior advisor to the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Strategy, Plans, and Forces, and as a country director for Pakistan. She has held previous research positions at CSIS, the Center for New American Security, and has worked with the International Labor Organization in Geneva and with the Senegalese Association for Research, Study, and Aid to Development. So without further ado, Dr. Thurston will discuss his new book, and let's dive into this fascinating subject. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much to CSIS and to the project on military and diplomatic history for having me here. Thanks to the other panelists and Jake for joining, and thanks to all of you for coming. I was asked to speak a course about my book, and because I'm here in the context of the project on military and diplomatic history, I thought I would place particular emphasis on the historical portion of the book and draw out in particular some of the political history of Boko Haram. Then I was also asked to speak about policy implications of some of my research, and so I'll talk about maybe what that political history might mean for a way out of the Boko Haram conflict. So before starting, I thought, just in case there are any folks here who are not very familiar with Nigeria or who are new to the topic, I thought I'd make just a few brief comments on Nigeria's importance. And that importance stems from a couple of just basic, mathematical points almost. One of those is Nigeria's population. So, estimates vary somewhat, but Nigeria probably has somewhere around 190 million people, which makes it the most populous country in Africa by far, and one of the most, 7th currently most populous country in the world, possibly on track to be the 3rd most populous country in the world by 2050, which would mean that it would displace the United States for that position. Then there's the importance of Nigeria's economy, perhaps around $410 billion GDP, making it the largest economy in Africa. Nigeria is usually the largest oil producer in Africa with 2 million barrels of oil per day, give or take maybe 500,000 barrels. And then there's Nigeria's tremendous cultural and literary production. Nigeria is home to some of the world's most accomplished novelists and filmmakers and thinkers, intellectuals, and so forth. So for all these reasons, Nigeria is arguably the most politically and culturally important country in Africa. It's also one of the most important countries in the world. In terms of Boko Haram, just to give a few kind of sketches of why Boko Haram matters, it's been sometimes accounted the deadliest movement in the world. Estimates also of the number of victims of the crisis vary, widely, but there's pretty broad agreement at this point that there have been 20,000 victims or more, including people who have been killed by Boko Haram, but also people who have been killed by security forces. Boko Haram has contributed to and exacerbated a humanitarian crisis that has affected up to 10 million people in the Lake Chad region, a humanitarian crisis comprising not just displacement, but also severe issues of hunger and disease and so forth. And then Boko Haram has had a tremendous economic impact. One estimate, even that's now outdated, was that Boko Haram had caused something like $9 billion worth of damage in northeastern Nigeria. Perhaps the figure is much higher than that. But for all these reasons, Nigeria matters, and then Boko Haram matters as well. In terms of the importance of history, so the book is a historical treatment of Boko Haram. It proceeds in 5 chapters. It starts with the 1970s when the founders were growing up, then moves on to look at the early political and religious history of the movement, then turns to the kind of way that the group became an underground, jihadist and guerrilla movement after a mass uprising that it launched in 2009. Then subsequent chapters turn to looking at how the movement carved out a massive territorial enclave in northeastern Nigeria in 2014, 2015. And the last chapter looks at the movement's kind of regionalization and efforts to regroup since that time. So there are many kind of threads in the book, many explanations that I put forth for Boko Haram. And I think any account of Boko Haram has to be multi-causal. You have to take into account structural factors, poverty, demographics, histories of interreligious conflicts. You have to take into account influences of regional and global jihadist actors. But among those threads, the one again that I want to highlight today is politics. So there are various ways that politics showed up in different parts of Boko Haram's history. One is, and this is again to return to the period when the movement's founders were growing up, one element of politics is a kind of a pattern of trying to move on after conflicts in Nigeria, move on without maybe sufficient attention to issues of accountability. So for example, one thing that the movement's founders would bitterly complain about in their preaching were incidents of Muslim-Christian conflict in the 1980s and 1990s. They would refer, multiple times back to an incident that took place in 1987 and several incidents that took place in the 1990s, and would say things like, these incidents show that the Nigerian state was built to attack Islam and to kill Muslims. So even incidents that occurred when the founders were teenagers became part of kind of the political fabric of the movement. And then this approach of sort of just trying to move on or to try to settle a conflict by force and then try to get everybody to move on afterwards became also part of the fabric of how authorities responded to the movement. In a more concrete sense, there are also local political roots of Boko Haram. So Boko Haram is obviously, in a way, first and foremost, a religious movement with an ideological basis that revolves around maybe 2 key stances, which I'm happy to go into more in Q&A, but just to sketch them really briefly. Boko Haram, of course, got its name from its opposition to Western-style schooling, which it regarded as immoral and anti-Islamic. That was also maybe part of a broader opposition to Western culture, Western civilization generally. And then Boko Haram's second key stance was an opposition to secular government, to government by constitution or government by parliamentary legislation and so forth. Nevertheless, despite those kind of stances, Boko Haram, and particularly its founder, Mohammed Yusuf, were intimately involved in politics, especially in the early 2000s. So to set the context a little bit, in 1999, after many decades basically of almost continuous military rule, Nigeria returned to a civilian multi-party competitive system. Nigeria is also, though, like the United States, a federal system that gives substantial power to state governments. So when there was the return to civilian-led democracy in 1999, the majority Muslim northern states, politicians made the argument that under federalism, the northern states should have the right to implement what was called full Sharia, or full Islamic law. So prior to that time, since independence, there had been Islamic law applied for kind of family and personal status issues. The drive for so-called full Sharia, though, was meant to include things like corporal punishments for crimes and other sort of aspects of what was understood as Sharia. The Sharia movement had, mass popular support from all the available evidence. It had the support of politicians, maybe some of whom were believers, some of whom were opportunists. It had the support of a lot of different kinds of Muslim scholars. Most of the people who backed the Sharia movement were not interested in jihadism. They weren't interested in building an Islamic State by force. It was within the context of the society a mainstream movement. At the same time, though, the Sharia movement gave opportunities to somebody like Mohammed Yusuf, the founder of Boko Haram, to make a mark. So even in 2001, Yusuf was selected to serve on a Sharia implementation committee in his home state. And then even more dramatically, there's a lot of evidence that in the 2003 election, Mohammed Yusuf had the opportunity to make a kind of a tactical alliance with the gubernatorial challenger in his state. So again, the Sharia movement began in 1999. Nigeria, like the United States, has 4-year terms for governors and president and so forth. So in 2003, a lot of that first class of civilian governors after 1999 were up for re-election. In most of the states in the north, governors, incumbent governors won re-election, in part because populations were more or less satisfied with their performance on this issue of implementing Sharia. In a couple of states, though, governors had been accused of being soft or lax or weak on implementing Sharia. One of those states was Boko Haram's home state of Borno. So there was an opportunity for Mohammed Yusuf to make an alliance with the challenger in the gubernatorial elections, who was making the argument in part that he would be a more enthusiastic implementer of Sharia if he came to power. Another part of the politics, though, was that after he won the election, he had less need of somebody like Mohammed Yusuf. It's different to be an incumbent rather than to be the challenger. As the incumbent, he had all kinds of opportunities to deepen and entrench his power, and then when he himself was up for re-election in 2007, he won a sweeping victory without the aid of somebody like Mohammed Yusuf. So over kind of the mid-2000s, Yusuf found himself more and more isolated by people who had been his former political allies, people who had been his former religious allies, and I think in a way backed himself into a corner. The same hardline rhetoric about Western-style education and politics that had won him a constituency in the first place and made him initially attractive to politicians as a partner ended up by the end of his life isolating him and pushing him toward what I mentioned before, this mass uprising that Boko Haram launched in 2009, which left over 1,000 people, including Yusuf himself, dead in the aftermath. Since that time, since the uprising of 2009, there have been various other kinds of ongoing political drivers of the conflict. There have been, first of all, the heavy-handed crackdowns that the Nigerian military has carried out, involving widespread human rights abuses, torture, executions, mass arrests, collective punishment of communities. There has been repeated instances of mistrust and disagreement between the federal government and the state and local authorities in the Northeast. And there has also been a kind of a political economy of the crisis that has taken hold. That's very hard to, establish evidence for, but even looking at kinds of accusations against people from the highest levels on down to rank and file soldiers, there are persistent accusations that people are benefiting from the crisis. That doesn't mean that they're direct collaborators with Boko Haram. It means that amid the crisis, they see opportunities to make money. So again, from even before the period of Boko Haram on up to the present, politics has been mixed into the crisis in all kinds of ways and is part of the fabric of the crisis. So in terms of the policy implications that brings us in the present, first of all, I see some real limits to the military approaches that have been tried. The kinds of crackdowns and particularly the collective punishment has been widely criticized. The recommendation from the US government and from other actors has been that Nigeria adopt a more sophisticated counterinsurgency strategy, sort of that Nigeria clean up its act in terms of military abuses against civilians, and that Nigeria launch a kind of broader socioeconomic reconstruction of the Northeast. As I've looked at the crisis over a number of years, though, I've come to feel that that's insufficient for solving the problem. That even if Nigeria did all of the things that it has been repeatedly counseled to do, that the problem would still linger. I think there are a number of reasons why counterinsurgency won't necessarily work. One of them is, I think the distrust between civilians and the military has become maybe so entrenched, particularly in certain rural areas, that I'm not sure that simple reforms would clean that up. I also think that the ultimate military defeat of Boko Haram may be very, very difficult to attain. So around the world, we've seen that when a major military mobilizes, it can drive jihadists out of cities, right? We've seen that in Iraq, we've seen that in Mali, we've seen that in Nigeria as well, where once Boko Haram carved out its territory, after the militaries of Nigeria and Chad and Niger and Cameroon mobilized, they were able to drive Boko Haram back in a relatively short period of time. But driving jihadists out of rural areas and really remote areas is another matter altogether. And we see that again in Mali or Libya or Nigeria as well. And so I think that given the kind of likelihood of persistent rural insecurity, given this problem of distrust, not just between civilians and the military, but also between various levels of the political class with each other, I think that it may be time to think about political solutions to the conflict. So there's also a history here which is worth mentioning. So from a relatively early point, there have been efforts at dialogue with Boko Haram, several of which have faltered, but I think have faltered in ways that nevertheless offer slight glimmers of hope. So in 2011, the former president of Nigeria, Obasanjo, made contact with the family members, or the in-laws rather, of Muhammad Yusuf, and had even opened a channel of communication with them. Unfortunately, after that, other Boko Haram members assassinated the brother-in-law of Yusuf, who had been talking with Obasanjo. So I'm not saying in any way that this is easy, or that there's not spoilers within the movement who would attempt to shut down any political negotiations. But there are these kind of precedents. Similarly, or on a related note, in 2012, there was a mediator initially identified by Boko Haram and by the government, who then withdrew himself, saying actually that he didn't trust the government side not to leak information. So again, an incident where dialogue faltered and didn't occur, but one that offers a glimmer of hope that there are maybe mediators out there who could be credible to both sides. More recently, then, there have been two waves of releases of some of the girls who were kidnapped at Chibok in 2014. And then very recently, there was another release of an oil prospecting team that had been kidnapped in the Northeast last year. Similarly, or on another level, there are various efforts at rehabilitation of Boko Haram members who have surrendered or who have been captured. Particularly in Nigeria, you have a program called Operation Safe Corridor. You also have in southeastern Niger an ongoing kind of amnesty and de-radicalization program. The numbers of people who participate in these initiatives are very small. So the best estimate I could find, for example, for the program in Niger was that it affects, or has something like 150 people now. So this is not necessarily, of course, adequate to deal with, a movement that may count, active combatants maybe in the low thousands, and a network, of course, of, supporters of varying degrees that may extend well into the thousands. But again, these are sort of glimmers of possibility of what might be able to happen. So in terms of political solutions, I mean, the basic thing about politics, right, is that it makes some people happy and other people unhappy, right? Any given political outcome is not going to be pleasing to everyone. But, so some of the, all of the basically political tools that Nigeria and the surrounding countries might consider are deeply flawed. So giving an amnesty to low-level fighters, trying to talk directly with some of the leadership about matters beyond just negotiations of hostages, forms of accountability and trials, not just for Boko Haram members, but also for members of the security forces or even politicians who have committed abuses. All of these things are deeply flawed solutions that would make some people very angry and that might make other people happy. But I think in some sense the challenge is if you have this kind of insurgency that has been going on steadily since 2010, and then you have a movement that has been around in one form or another, possibly even since the mid-1990s. Clearly just a kind of a military approach is not necessarily going to work. And so I think it's time to, if I was going to make a policy recommendation, which I do almost somewhat reluctantly, it would be again to, to bring in politics and to experiment with different kinds of solutions that, even if they're not perfect, would at least try to find a way out of the crisis. So I'll stop there and then look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Alexander. That's a very frank, honest assessment of the challenge the group poses. Jennifer, you'd like to pitch in?
Yeah, sure. First of all, congratulations, Alex.
Oh, thanks.
And thank you. I mean, this is a huge and valuable contribution.
Thank you.
I know that I will go back and back to the book. There are so many narratives around the rise of Boko Haram, what propelled it, and I think some of it less authoritative than others. This is incredibly well-researched, well-written, and I think brings those narratives together in a way and frames them. I mean, I think what you describe in the rise of Boko Haram is very particular, the timing, the circumstances, the personalities involved, to Yusuf and Borno State politics. But the bigger structural issues, kind of the religious fragmentation and competition that has people competing for kind of moral authority and for followers, the political alliances of convenience, and then the broad popular grievances that allow these individuals to kind of play on a sense of victimhood, play on a sense of moral righteousness. All of those are very true in much of northern Nigeria, I would say, and in much of West Africa as well. And so, and not to mention the government response, a very ham-handed government response, which then in turn fuels that narrative of victimhood and persecution. So, I mean, I think one of the things, this is both a great look into Boko Haram, but also how do you spot this when it is happening? How do you preempt it? At what moments might there have been opportunities to kind of deflect the course of Yusuf, who began, as you say, kind of as a movement. He didn't start out as a jihadist fighter. Began as a movement and slowly kind of morphed through these various circumstances to a more militarized force. And then obviously the second iteration of Boko Haram under Shekau, much more violent. So what have we learned from that? What has Nigeria learned? I fear that it has not learned that much. If you look at the IMN, the Islamic Movement of Nigeria in Zaria State in 2016, a brutally ham-handed military response to marches by Nigeria's Shia movement, capture and grievous injury to the leader. very little accountability for that. It is a pattern that repeats itself again and again. And so, I mean, it's so reminiscent of the origins of the militarization of Boko Haram, that heavy-handed response that fueled down the line a more militant iteration. I guess a couple of, to your kind of policy issues, I mean, I agree there is no military solution to this. You're not going to, and despite claims of victory, you're not going to be able to defeat every last fighter. But there is a role for the military, even to provide the space for the kind of structural changes that you need done, even perhaps to pressure the leaders to take negotiations seriously. But getting that military balance right is the key. And just on the positive note, I mean, Boko Haram has been significantly weakened. It is being cleared off of territory, which it had a fairly loose hold on to begin with. It's not clear what it meant when to control territory. It didn't exactly govern those cities. The countries of the region have become engaged in the MNJTF, the Multinational Joint Task Force of Chad, Niger, Cameroon, Benin. Nigeria have in some ways kind of contained the problem to some extent within the region. I think, so, one question is how enduring is the MNJTF? Does it keep up as the group becomes weakened? Does its incentive to kind of continue to contain, does that diminish over time? The other question of kind of cordoning Boko Haram off is the question of finances, and maybe that goes to a question to you in terms of what are their sources of financing. We've heard from bank robberies and kidnappings, but there are not that many banks in northeast Nigeria right now that are functioning. So I wonder if you might say a little bit more about their external links, both to Al-Qaeda, kind of in the early days, to ISIL, what that Pledge of Allegiance to ISIL might mean, particularly as ISIL is getting squeezed elsewhere, and to other sources of financing across Africa and beyond. The second, I'd say policy recommendation, you kind of dismiss the idea that the military will ever be able to regain trust in some of the military, in some of the rural areas. I mean, it's still worth pursuing. You did see towns cheering the Nigerian military when they were liberated. I mean, you do see more kind of memorials to fallen soldiers and so forth. So it's not, the military, no question, has committed egregious abuses, but I think it's still worth trying to pursue a policy of building trust between communities and the military. And in that regard, I mean, the Civilian Joint Task Force has been kind of one of those links that has, lots of problems associated with it, but it has served as kind of a link to communities, between communities and the military in terms of passing on information and so forth. So maybe you want to say a little bit about that as well. And you talked, too, about kind of how do you, the possibility of negotiation with Boko Haram, but how, too, do you provide a much more enticing and compelling off-ramp for some of the fighters within. 150 people when there's hundreds or there's thousands of prisoners, many surrenders, to not have a plan for defectors strikes me as a real gap. I have lots and lots of questions, but I will reserve them because I know everybody else does as well. But those external linkages and the Civilian Joint Task Force maybe are my initial queries.
Do you want me to respond first, or?
Sure, if that works for you.
Okay.
Yeah, and then we'll go to Alice.
So first of all, I mean, thank you for this rich, feedback and intervention, and I mean, these are crucial questions. One thing, just to underscore what you were saying at first about kind of the origins of the group. I mean, I think one puzzle for me was, a lot of people have said, okay, this group is the result of, unemployed young men and radical preachers and so forth. But you can find that in many places, right? So why did the group emerge in this particular place, right? At this particular time? Why, if all you needed were, jobless young men and radical preachers, then you would see Boko Haram's, from I don't know, from Somalia to Mauritania, Some would say that you do, but I don't think so. You would see more than we see now. So I do think, that's what I try to do in a lot of the book, is to look at, okay, what are actually the micro, local factors that propelled this movement? In terms of the financing and the external connections, so with the external connections, this is something I try to deal with really carefully in the book, because on the one hand, there have been analyses that have consistently privilege these external ties and have read them as kind of the defining factor for Boko Haram. I think that's the wrong way to approach the movement. At the same time, though, more and more documents have come out, particularly maybe in the last 3 or 4 years, especially as the CIA has declassified things that were taken in the raid on bin Laden's compound in Pakistan. And some of those documents have shed some light on ties between Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda's Saharan affiliate AQIM and Boko Haram during the period before 2015, when Boko Haram pledged allegiance to the Islamic State. I think, to me, what those documents show is that there were various kinds of interchanges, but that AQIM and Al-Qaeda found that they could not control Abu Bakr Shekau. Basically, that he was going to, sometimes say really nice things to them, but then he was basically going to do, what he wanted to do. In terms of actual financial exchanges documented in those materials that have been released, the only one that I'm aware of is a transfer of something like 200,000 euros from AQIM to Boko Haram, probably in early 2010. So this is a sum that's worth paying attention to, but it's not, again, enough to explain the whole financing. So I think, and the financing to me is one of the murkiest aspects of the whole story. I think it must have come from, and must still come from, a mix of factors. So you heard, especially a couple of years ago, about bank robberies, as you mentioned. Definitely then there have also been, kidnappings for ransom, maybe particularly since 2013. Some kidnappings in Cameroon, and then there was this big Wall Street Journal investigation into the releases of the Chibok girls recently. I think that they said, if I recall correctly, that it was something like 3 million maybe for the first batch of, or maybe total. But in any case, but this is pretty recently. So early on, I think, bank robberies, but also probably some significant level of implication in local economies. So, and basically forms of extortion, I guess is what I'm saying. So even up to the present, you read stories about, bringing fish from the shores of Lake Chad, to markets in Maiduguri and elsewhere, that suggests that there's a lot of kind of actors trying to get in on that game to basically charge fishermen tariffs and things like that. So I think that must have been part of the financing as well. But again, this is one of the murkiest, aspects to me of the whole thing. In terms of the CJTF, so for those who aren't familiar, so there's the initial military deployment, especially in 2011, was called the Joint Task Force, Nigerian military deployment. Starting in 2013, there were these civilian vigilante groups that emerged that became known as the Civilian Joint Task Force. Groups that seem to have had a real organic and grassroots basis on one level, but that at least if they were not sort of, I don't think they were completely sort of astroturfed by the state, but they were at least co-opted very quickly, and funded and welcomed and given substantial kind of license to operate, to run checkpoints, to assist directly in missions and even combat operations against Boko Haram. So the CJTF, I think, became kind of a double-edged sword in the sense that they helped push Boko Haram out of major cities, or helped regain major control in these big cities, but then also by pushing Boko Haram more into the countryside, generated that initial major bid for territorial control, or accelerated it, and then maybe left us with some of the problems that we have today. And then, of course, there are all the sorts of pros and cons of, on the one hand, if you stand up this kind of local civilian vigilante force, it gives you all kinds of, capabilities against Boko Haram, right? Because these are people who are from that area, who probably know Boko Haram members, who have invaluable kinds of intelligence roles to play. But then the con is you have yet another, major group of armed young men whose future is not clear. maybe last I'll say on the military's role and the military-civilian distrust, I probably overstated that. I mean, I don't want to say that there's no possibility that the military could win back civilians' trust, but I guess I see repeated indications up to the present that distrust has really remained in some places. And then I'm concerned by the military's rhetoric. Sometimes you look at the statements they put out and they talk about BHTs, Boko Haram terrorists. Say, okay, we killed 46 BHTs. We cleared out this area. We did, it's kind of like an exterminationist sort of rhetoric. Kind of an idea. Sometimes it sounds like what they're saying is, we need to kill all these guys, and then the problem is going to be over. Yeah. And so, I guess I'm concerned that rhetoric has persisted up to the present. I'm sure that they could make a change, and I'm sure that they could really substantially, improve relations with rural communities and so forth. But I think it would be a long road from here.
Thank you. Alice?
My turn?
Yeah.
So I think I'm going to echo a lot of what Jennifer said. I'll try to put new spins on it. But I also loved this book to the extent that you can love reading about Boko Haram. It's a real achievement. I really encourage everyone here. I'm selling your book for you. I really encourage everyone here to read it. I really wish I had this resource when I was in government.
Thank you.
I just think it's rich, it's full of deep context for practitioners and academics. And it interrogates many of the debates that we have over Boko Haram and applies useful correctives to a lot of, I think, the hasty or underinformed, sometimes from lack of deep research like you've pulled together, hasty conclusions that we can sometimes make, particularly in a practitioner space, because we're trying to make things happen rapidly. And so, again, I think it's a real asset to the practitioner side. So I want to highlight just a few of the things I found especially thought-provoking in this piece as part of my selling the book to you all. And then a couple of areas where I think we could continue to refine what Alex has offered us here. Yeah. So as Alex and Jennifer both said, the history piece of this is incredibly useful. The first chapter is called The Life World of Muhammad Yusuf, and that's a fantastic way to frame it, is to say, where did this character come from? What is the local context that shaped him? What is local context that made his message appealing to such a large range of people across the entire North? That's really, really valuable in understanding where Boko Haram came from. The major factors that made Boko Haram appeal, particularly in Maiduguri, at the very beginning, Alex says it's not just a northern Nigerian, it's not just a northeastern Nigerian, it is a phenomenon that started in Maiduguri, and I want to know why. Mm-hmm. That's fascinating and I think useful when we think about solutions going forward. He explains the process of radicalization, particular to the area, how it interacted with local religious and political authorities, why Boko Haram turned to violence and its more recent focus on regional governments. It all follows this logical thread that taking this historical perspective really helps you see in a way that I know when I was in government, I looked at it a lot more episodically and wished I had that narrative. And the localizing piece is really powerful. I know I spent a lot of time, or have spent a lot of time in my career talking about Nigeria, trying to make that argument that Boko Haram, I think more so perhaps than other extremist groups that we look at from the West, is really, really localized, and we really need to understand the local dynamics. I especially appreciate the detailed examination of the notion that Boko Haram is or has been a function or extension of the larger global jihadist phenomenon and movement. There's a great section in, I think, chapter 4, about what connections have existed between Boko Haram and core Al-Qaeda and AQIM. And really, casts a lot of doubt on the idea that there's a real meaningful connection there, which is a really live debate amongst folks that do security on the US side. And so I think that it's the first place that I've seen all in one place this really, really good comprehensive look at, okay, well, what we know about the connections between AQIM and Boko Haram, what did that really mean operationally for the group, but also sort of what are the ideological overlaps and divergences. Just incredibly useful resource again. Alex brings religion back in. I think, again, especially in the US and in the West, counterterrorism analysts can get very uncomfortable with trying to think about the debates about the proper role of Islam in society and how that plays into these extremist groups. And he goes there and looks at it and says, this is really important and we need to grapple with it. And gives us that context and then really connects it to real choices Boko Haram has made over time, which I think was very, very useful, including fissures within the group that we've seen over time that we see today. And as Alex said, he brings politics back into the study of Boko Haram, and he makes this really persuasive argument. And I'd never thought of it this way, but it's a simple and elegant point that is very true, which is that many terrorism analysts try to depoliticize the origins and the solutions to violent extremism. You know, this is an economic problem, or you know, there are pure security solutions to this, and he really takes us through why that's not true and why we really need to understand the political context and the political motivations and interests that are involved here. And up front, he defines for you, by politics, he means control over resources, and he means control over the values a society will live by. And you can see why for Boko Haram, but for many extremist groups, that those two things are really important. And so he, you know, as you're reading it, you have to face those things, which is really, really helpful. I do want to probe a couple of things, one of which Jennifer brought up, and I'm just going to echo, I think, what she said. But while I think the emphasis on religion and politics is great, and the emphasis on politics as part of the solution is really important, I do think in the book the shift away from security might be a little overdetermined. You know, security and repression aren't the same thing, and we shouldn't cede that space to the unfortunate track record of the security services we've seen. And I don't think we should let go of the need to mount a considerable defense against Boko Haram for those communities. You know, Jennifer talked about people cheering in the streets for the idea that there's someone out there to protect them. So I think, you know, we can think more creatively, and certainly the Nigerian government can think more expansively about what's the meaning of security really is, because it's not generally the approach they've taken. But I also don't think that means we should say that it's not an important part of the solution, which you're not quite saying that in the book, but you, I think to make your politics point, you kind of lose the role that security services could be playing that could be positive. And then, despite sharing your skepticism with Boko Haram's connections to outside extremist groups, I do think one of the reasons we should study and understand Boko Haram is because of the patterns it does share with other extremist groups. We talked about this a little bit at lunch. Our colleague Alexis brought this up in comparing them to the GIA in Algeria. You know, Alex actually notes that trajectory a little bit in the book as well, but thinking about how, you know, GSPC became AQIM, and this very real debate about whether or not civilians should be targets and who an apostate is. You know, Boko Haram has had and is having these same debates. That has involved ISIS's connections, such that they are with Boko Haram. And so I think, you know, as we look at Boko Haram, we can get lessons about how it has developed over time, and also how the West has interacted with these groups. You know, particularly for Boko Haram, the gain and loss of territory is perhaps full of lessons for how we might expect ISIS to adapt to its new circumstances in the Middle East. So I think that's one thing to sort of hang on to. And again, you mention it in the book, but it doesn't pop quite as much as I would have liked. And then at the very end of the book, you get into the regionalization piece. And I just wonder how much that undermines the idea that Boko Haram is local anymore, right? Is it sort of delocalizing? Have they become decoupled sufficiently from local dynamics in northeastern Nigeria that they are a new thing, or that they're motivated by new things? And then again, in our conversations about what the political solution is, what would the deal look like? Is the deal really about Maiduguri anymore to Boko Haram, or is it about something else? And I don't know that we have a good sense of that, but we definitely need to develop one. So I'll leave it there and look forward to the discussion with everyone here.
Well, thanks. I mean, these are really great, you know, questions and points. And I guess I should say on the security issue, I mean, I'm not I'm not a Quaker, but I'm probably Quaker curious. We'll say. So, I probably go too far in downplaying some of the security approaches. I mean, certainly, I think that Nigeria and Niger and Chad and Cameroon are, first of all, sovereign countries that have a right to control their territory and a duty to control their countries. A duty to control territory. There is or should be a social contract with citizens such that their citizens can live safely in those places in all parts of the country. And I think that mandates a security response. And I've been concerned. We were talking about this a little bit over lunch as well. We're talking about the idea to have fortress towns in Borno State, or even places that would be, I don't think the Nigerians, when they were proposing this, or the authorities in Borno, used the phrase strategic hamlets, but that came up at lunch too, and obviously that's an ominous sort of phrase. But there is this kind of proposal on the table to group people in basically 5 major urban centers in Borno, and that starts to sound like ceding a lot of the countryside to various components of Boko Haram. I think that would be the wrong move, and I think that there needs to be more of an effort to project security into the countryside, and I think that I've been worried by Boko Haram's kind of, even you could say, intimidation of the military in the countryside. I mean, one of the factions of Boko Haram has kind of, to my view, been systematically targeting small rural military outposts and convoys and things, and this I think scares or possibly intimidates. Maybe scare is too strong of a word, but I think it has contributed to maybe this idea that the military should pull back a little bit. But I guess I would like to see the security track and the politics track proceed in tandem, right? I don't think that means necessarily that the security is going to be the pressure that's going to force Boko Haram to the table. I think that's probably too much to hope for. But I think that the security situations will never be such that it's sort of the perfect moment to open a dialogue, so I think you might as well try to open a dialogue now. In terms of what the deal would look like, I guess first of all I should say I think that if there ever were deals, there would be deals plural, in part because you have 4 countries involved. And I think you already see that to an extent, because you have, as I mentioned, this kind of small off-ramp in Nigeria called, Operation Safe Corridor, and then you have this de-radicalization effort in the Difa region of Niger. Those programs, to my knowledge, are proceeding in parallel rather than as one kind of coordinated effort. So I think you're already starting to see different localized deals offered to fighters. In terms of what an overall deal would look like, I think that to my mind, there can't be a question of offering a territorial enclave to Boko Haram, or of offering Boko Haram a major say in what the political character of Nigeria or the other countries are going to be. There can't be any kind of deal that involves a more intensive application of Sharia or a nationwide application of Sharia. I mean, if those things ever came to pass, they would have to be things that the mass majority of voters wanted, right? They can't just be offered as a deal, and I don't think the mass majority of voters want that, not even necessarily in the north. So I think that the deal has to concern kind of pragmatic issues, and basically, if there was a deal, it would be, you come in, you lay down arms, you go through a judicial process that will result in something less than execution, and then you will, if you are a low-level fighter who has not committed serious abuses, maybe you'll be, sent through a program and then you'll be released. If you're somebody who's at a more senior level, who's committed, different kinds of egregious abuses or has systematically ordered them, then you will remain in prison for a longer or shorter time. Obviously, as we debated at lunch, that's not a perfect deal, right? And there would be plenty of reasons why, Boko Haram or individual commanders would refuse and even laugh at that. But I think maybe offering something like that repeatedly until it's accepted would be better than the present approach. In terms of Boko Haram delocalizing, you get a debate over this, which I'm sure you probably got even more of when you were in government than I have from the outside. But there are analysts who say, okay, Boko Haram is fundamentally a movement of the Kanuri ethnic group, and therefore it operates in a fundamentally Kanuri zone, right? So, essentially, southeastern Niger and northeastern Nigeria and so forth, and that it won't spread out of that zone. From my own perspective, I see that as a weak line of analysis, because I think the movement has always been multi-ethnic. The founders have always used, Hausa and Arabic as lingua franca much more than they've used Kanuri. There's never been any talk about kind of we're a movement of Kanuri ethnic self-assertion or anything like that. But with that said, I still do see the movement as parochial in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it has struck, of course, outside of its zone. It struck in the capital of Nigeria, Abuja, several times in 2011. It struck in the capital of Chad in 2015. They even claimed an attack in Lagos, in far southwestern Nigeria, for those who don't know the geography. But, they've always kind of come back to that, zone. And I think southeastern Niger and northern Cameroon, far northern Cameroon, are part of that zone where they feel comfortable. So I guess I don't yet. So I still regard them as sort of local to that area. If they gained a lot of momentum, I think they could expand outside of that area, but it hasn't necessarily happened yet. The last piece I would say, I totally agree that there's ample room for comparison with other jihadist groups and lessons. And as I was trying to think about Boko Haram's future, I kept coming back to, well, what was and is the trajectory of AQIM? What was and is the trajectory of Shabab and so forth? And there, I think, the tenacity of different groups is what stands out. And I don't want to say that to be alarmist. I really personally am sort of off-put by the analysts who, as soon as there's a military victory against ISIS, they take to the newspapers to say, ISIS is more dangerous than ever, it'll be back, in a different form, 3.0 or whatever, I think that kind of analysis can be way too hysterical. But at the same time, there is this tenacity that these groups have shown and a patience maybe too. I think that doesn't necessarily require people to lose perspective, but I think it does require taking a long-term approach and thinking about, okay, what really is going to be the end of these groups, and I don't think that all of their members can be killed or that they can just be, sort of crushed.
All right. Well, thank you all. It's been a great discussion, and y'all have addressed a lot of the questions that I had when I was reading through the book, so this has been very helpful for me personally. Before we open it up to audience questions, I was actually hoping to use moderator's privilege to pick the experts' brains for a second. So I think here in the DC foreign policy community, when we hear Nigeria, we immediately think of Boko Haram, or a lot of us. That's kind of the number one issue to a lot of us that's going on there. But obviously Nigeria is facing a number of challenges, right? There was an article recently that noted that in 2016 and 2017, conflict in the Middle Belt between Fulani pastoralists and farmers killed more people than Boko Haram did in those years. And in some instances, those conflicts have actually taken on sectarian overtones. You've got the crisis in Niger Delta, where there's always a possibility that these groups could reemerge, threaten Nigeria's oil supply, its energy security, and then you've got elections upcoming this year, or presidential primaries will start for the 2019 elections. So I'm wondering, as someone who follows what's going on in Nigeria, how much are ordinary Nigerians, and I imagine this differs from country to country, but is Boko Haram kind of like the one existential threat that all Nigerians agree upon, or are they equally concerned or even more concerned about some of these more local issues? And then I guess, to open it up a bit, for those of us for those of y'all who have been in government, what would you hope maybe that the current policymakers understand about Nigeria outside of just the specific issue of Boko Haram?
Well, thanks very much. This is really important, and one reason that I began by highlighting Nigeria's importance, and in particular why I wanted to highlight Nigeria's cultural production, is that it again is an incredibly diverse place that has so much going for it. Not to put it in some kind of like patronizing way, but Nigeria has I mean, it's just an incredible place that again is full of some of the most talented people in the world. And so I think even while I want to stress the importance of Boko Haram, and maybe in some ultimate sense, the biggest importance of Boko Haram is the way that it has exacerbated this humanitarian crisis. I mean, because that's the most number of people affected, right? I mean, by the time you get to these regional estimates of up to 10 million people being affected, I mean, that's where the mass impact, I think, is felt most of all. But for the country as a whole, I don't think it's ever been an existential threat. I think even when there were suicide bombings in Abuja and so forth, I think there was practically zero chance that Boko Haram would overthrow the central government or make Lagos a major area of operations or really spread throughout the country. I mean, now you hear isolated reports of cells in different parts of the country. Obviously, it's made the Northeast into a really hectic zone, and it's ruined thousands of people's lives there. But for the country as a whole, I don't think it's ever been that existential challenge. So in terms of how ordinary people see it or are affected by it, I think it really varies based on social class, where you live, what you do. For some people, in southern parts of the country and even in the northwestern parts of the country, I mean, it can be remote from their daily concerns. Ordinary kinds of, issues that any person faces in their daily life can loom much larger than Boko Haram. So in that sense, I think there's a localized impact, or at least a regional impact. In terms of other perspectives that policymakers should keep in mind, then I guess I would want them to keep some of the things I said before in mind. I mean, just the diversity of the place, the multiple trajectories of the place. I mean, if Nigeria is on track to be the third most populous country in the world, then the United States and Nigeria are going to need to work together in all kinds of ways. And they're going to need to work together on a basis of equality, and the kind of, frankly, sort of condescension that the United States will show toward, countries outside of, the kind of capitalist core or whatever, that kind of condescension, I think, is going to have to go away. We're going to have to deal, which is the right thing to do anyway. You shouldn't condescend to people, but we're going to have to look at Nigeria as an equal partner with whom we want to accomplish things. And so I think that looking at it through a security lens is a mistake. Even looking at it just through an economic lens, I think, could be a mistake too. And so I think, again, policymakers should keep in mind the importance and the trajectory too, that importance is only going to increase over time.
If you'd like to chime in real quick. Yeah.
Well, I guess, I think Alex has said it, but in terms of kind of what we should know about Nigeria, you said it in the introduction. I mean, I think the upcoming elections are hugely important and uncertain at this point. I do think it's important when thinking about Nigeria, and I've said this before, we think of one government, the government of Nigeria.
Right.
In fact, there's 37 governments. There's the federal government, and then there's state governments. And often we lay the onus on the federal government for everything, for, health, education, all those things, many of which are the responsibilities of state government. And I think more as we look to engage Nigeria. I mean, the diversity of the place. Not every place is a basket case, but we tend to kind of paint Nigeria with this very broad brush. How do you engage at the state government level, rather than funneling everything through a federal government, which at the end of the day has limited authority in how much it can spend in a particular state that's constitutionally set, and how much it can tell state governors what to do. And we talk about corruption. Usually we talk about it at the federal level, but there are massive levels of corruption and shenanigans happening at the state level, as we saw in Borno State. So, I mean, I think in terms of U.S. even diplomatic and development engagement, focusing more at the state level is one thing. One is identifying kind of those areas of real success and kind of supporting them, versus what we tends to be a very negative narrative about Nigeria here, because we focus on all the problems. So that's what I would want policymakers to know.
I think that's a crucial point. I mean, and that was something that I felt in the year that I was a fellow for CFR, which I was placed at the State Department in the Africa Bureau during that time, I was sometimes concerned that that the US government was talking to too narrow a range of interlocutors in Nigeria. In particular, this point about working at the subnational level, and then probably also not engaging enough with opposition actors, because Nigeria is a country where power changes at the ballot box oftentimes, and the opposition candidate today may be the president tomorrow or the governor tomorrow. So I think just broadening the aperture of who we look at and consider important is crucial.
Yeah, and I guess my plea is in our security assistance relationships globally. I mean, this is not just Africa or just Nigeria. We really fixate on sort of small unit training, particularly in the CT context. And I'm the civil military relations analyst in the room, but the civil military context in Nigeria is wildly important. I'm not sure we always think about it as carefully or as thoroughly as we ought to. And we talk a lot about Modadiri, which is the Minister of Defense Advisors and Defense Institution building programs. But I think we could put a lot more muscle behind that and think a lot more about how a democracy like Nigeria manages its security approaches, right? And not just sort of exhort them to try and use counterinsurgency, but to actually think about how does this democracy manage defense institutions such that they will exercise sort of democratic will in the security space. It's incredibly hard. Our relationship with Nigeria, is difficult. But I think it's one of the spaces where engagement would be really, really positive. And I think both at the federal and the state levels, it would be great to have these conversations.
Great, thank you. Well, in that case, I think we'll open it up to audience questions. We have a microphone here. So if you could just, when you stand up, state your name, affiliation. Please keep your question short and a question. Thank you. We'll go, sir, with you up front here.
David through Johns Hopkins, CSIS, and George Washington. I'm going to break your command by making a brief statement. I enjoyed your book. I found it, of all the books I've read on Boko Haram, by far and away the most interesting. But I have a fundamental disagreement. I'm one of those old-fashioned bods who actually think Borno and Kanuri are quite distinct from northern Nigeria as a whole. And although Boko Haram may have wider ambitions, it does not seem to me surprising that such a movement should arise in Maiduguri and have essentially a Kanuri base, even if it has wider ambitions. So my questions: would you agree that Borno, even in terms of northern Nigeria, is marginalized, is poor, distinct, and has profound social grievances, probably even greater than other parts of northern Nigeria? Secondly, would you agree that Borno and the Kanuri have a profoundly conservative version of Islam, which is historically much more entrenched and much more conservative than, say, in the Hausa Fulani areas? Would you agree that the social structure of Kanuri is, even by northern Nigerian standards, very, very conservative? And the killer is the fourth one. Are we actually seeing a social revolution being undertaken in Kanuri society that is actually engendering movements like Boko Haram because of the challenge to patriarchal authority and the traditional power structure? And if you would agree with that, does that actually suggest that perhaps we haven't seen anything yet, and that Boko Haram and northeastern Nigeria is going to remain a center of instability until Kanuri society has worked its way through that process, which may well take 20 or 30 years?
Thank you, sir. A lot to unpack there.
Yeah, I think, no, I mean, I thank you for this, and I think that, I mean, first of all, I mean, there are definitely, so my approach to history has been to look at Boko Haram during the lifetime of people who were involved with it, right? So for me, that's basically at the maximum late 1960s to the present. Certainly there are historical treatments coming out that promise to be very interesting and informative that take a longer view, right? So there's a book coming out from Oxford, I'll probably mispronounce his name, but Scott McAkern from, is writing this long-term book, and I haven't read it yet because it's not out. So there are people who have tried to locate, long-term historical dynamics and dynamics more particular to Kanuri society. I guess I would agree with some of what you said, although I think that if Boko Haram had emerged in, say, northwestern Nigeria, that we could say, well, isn't, Sokoto particularly conservative, and things like, I mean, there could be a parallel set of questions if the movement had emerged somewhere else. And again, I don't think, I've seen the estimate, okay, 70 to 80% Kanuri, but I would repeat a little bit of what I said before. I mean, Yusuf and Shekau have oftentimes used Hausa, not that they never preached in Kanuri or anything, but they've often used in Hausa. There's, to me also, maybe more importantly, I think there's been a series of ruptures in Maiduguri and in the Northeast. And so more than sort of pointing to long-term trends among the Kanuri, I would also point to those ruptures. First of all, generational conflicts among religious leaders, such that Yusuf could be seen, Muhammad Yusuf, the founder of Boko Haram, could be seen as an expression of Kanuri conservatism, but he's also somebody who benefited from the deaths of older leaders and who took a much different kind of theological position than kind of the leaders who are now in their 60s, 70s, 80s, or who have died. He also benefited a lot from being part of Salafi networks that comprised primarily Hausa preachers, and his main mentor for a time until they broke was Jafar Mahmoud Adam, who was ethnically Hausa, who came from Daura basically, and who was invited to give the Ramadan exegesis of the Quran from about 1994 on. So, and he was the one, there's even a story, who knows if it's true, of him taking Yusuf's hand at a mass meeting and holding him up and say, if there's no scholars left in Borno, this is the guy for you, But this was, so Yusuf benefited from being part of networks that went beyond, the Kanuri. Also, I think that, the experience of urbanization has to be taken into account, and I think that Yusuf benefited from disruptions within Kanuri society as people moved to the city, and also disruptions in other parts of Borno State as people moved into the city, and I think that he, so whereas, if you go back to sort of classical anthropological accounts of the Kanuri, people would, if you were a young Kanuri man and you needed to borrow money, you could borrow from your, mother's relatives and so forth. A lot of patterns like that became disrupted, I think, once people moved to the city. And I think Yusuf was able to offer people, to some extent, an alternative, form of solidarity. Anyway, with all that said, I think that, the perspective that you're voicing, as I understand it so far, and my perspective, are not at all incompatible. And maybe where they align the most is in this question of, have we sort of not seen anything yet in the Northeast? I think that it's quite possible that the stage is set for further conflict. I don't think that the next iteration of that conflict will sort of be Boko Haram 2.0. A lot of people have drawn a parallel between Boko Haram and the Maitatsine movement of the 1980s. I think that parallel can be taken somewhat far, but then there are also profound differences between Boko Haram and Maitatsine, theologically, in terms of connections to external actors. Maitatsine obviously not part of the global jihadist movement. So if you think about kind of the differences between Boko Haram and Maitatsine, then Boko Haram and whatever may come next could be just as different as that. So the stage, I think, could be set for more conflict, but I don't think that necessarily means we know what the next stage would look like. So, but thanks for your questions. I'm happy to talk afterwards.
I'm glad you brought up the urbanization dynamics. That was a fascinating part of your book, really.
Thanks.
So, all right, thank you. Ma'am, right there in the third row.
Hello, my name is Astrid Ruiz. I've lived in Nigeria and worked in Nigeria for 10 years. So if from a historical point of view, and I haven't had the pleasure of reading your book yet, what is the role of geopolitics of Western country from a historical perspective in terms of the development of Boko Haram? Does it have any role? And in terms of solutions, I have serious doubts that the solution can come from the political arena. What people-centered strategies can be taken, particularly focused on women and youths as agents for change? And in terms of laying down arms, if it didn't work in the Niger Delta, why do you think it would work in this case? And in terms of what lessons can we learn, I think there are important lessons to be learned, especially in what's going on in Niger now, particularly in the Gaia region. Isn't the best defense prevention? And what role can the Millennium Challenge Corporation, who is operating a big project focused on irrigation, what role does MCC work in terms of prevention instead of making things worse? And finally, instead of, you mentioned rhetoric and the number, always talking about the number of people killed. Doesn't that rhetoric reflect the US rhetoric? Thank you.
So I don't understand the last question, actually.
Yeah, you mentioned, I think you mentioned, or maybe another speaker, this focus on the number of Boko Haram members killed, okay, that the Nigerian army likes to list the number of people killed.
Right.
My question is, doesn't that reflect the US rhetoric?
So I mean, yeah. So to take the, kind of last question and first question together, the main impact that I see of Western countries. I mean, I see no direct impact in the genesis of Boko Haram, but the main impact I see is, what I would call the war on terror context. And here I should acknowledge my wife, who's in the front row, who's book came out last year about Morocco and the war on terror. But anyway, kind of an ongoing conversation that we've had about the war on terror has really shaped my thinking on this. I mean, I think that the atmosphere of the war on terror and the decision that the United States has made to treat terrorism and particularly jihadism as matters of war rather than as law enforcement problems and political problems, I think that atmosphere has shaped the behavior of other governments around the world. And so I think after a while, and it's not maybe an accident that some of the initiatives that came close to opening dialogue with Boko Haram were in 2011 and 2012. There are a lot of reasons that they failed. Maybe they were always doomed. But, that came before, the US, Nigeria, and Britain all designated Boko Haram as a foreign terrorist organization or, variants of that for the British and Nigerian governments. I mean, I think that the atmosphere of the war on terror discourages negotiations with jihadist movements. And I think to some extent, if I understood your last question correctly, I think sure, the United States also maybe promotes sort of an exterminationist mindset vis-a-vis jihadist groups. I mean, certainly if you look at the rhetoric in the United States after we kill, jihadist leaders, be it, bin Laden or, Nasser al-Buhayshi in Yemen or whoever it may be, I mean, there can be a kind of a triumphalism sometimes, and I think that's not necessarily that helpful. In terms of solutions, and what you said about people-centric solutions and women and girls, I mean, I think we should think about what kind of solutions are we talking about and over what kind of time period. Because I think sometimes there's been a conflation of solutions to this immediate crisis right now with solutions to kind of long-term problems, right? And this gets back to the other question about have we seen sort of nothing yet in the Northeast? So to me, I mean, the solutions to the present crisis of Boko Haram, I think, are necessarily going to be somewhat messy if they happen at all. Like I said, politics is a process of making some people happy and other people unhappy, right? I mean, anything that you can think of, any political solution, amnesty, dialogues, negotiations, et cetera, is going to make a lot of people angry. And some people may be rightfully so. If you're a victim of Boko Haram, excuse me, who wants to see an amnesty for them? There's also, of course, as you mentioned, the precedent of the Niger Delta, which, I think the argument in favor of that amnesty would be that it put a lid on some of the worst conflict in the Niger Delta. The argument against it would be, former militant leaders, live lavishly in, nice hotel rooms, and, there was nothing really done for the rank and file of, the Niger Delta movements, that there's still, oil bunkering and all kinds of tremendous problems. And I think many Nigerians would justifiably say, well, wait, given that this was the flawed outcome in the Delta, why would we try anything even remotely similar in the Northeast? But I think that, again, the duration of the insurgency, the tenacity of Boko Haram, brings me back to this question of dialogue and political solutions, which is a terrible solution. It's just maybe not quite as terrible as some of the other approaches that have been tried already. Then with the question of kind of population-centric or long-term social transformations, I think there we need to be careful, because a lot of CVE or other kinds of interventions, to my mind, have amounted to trying to promote Western liberal values to people who have not yet committed violence, right? So if you haven't committed violence, why should you necessarily adopt a certain attitude vis-a-vis girls' education or democracy? Or the question should be, right, have you killed other people or not? Or have you tried to kill other people or not? If you haven't, I don't necessarily think that the US government should make you into a target of a project of trying to reshape how you think about the world. I understand some of the arguments for, if, gender attitudes change, or if, attitudes toward liberal values change, then there's a lower likelihood of conflict in the future. But I'm not sure that that's true. And I think sometimes the kind of cultural projects that we try to impose on other peoples can be, pretty heavy-handed. And again, I think, the more pressing question to me, how do you solve this conflict sort of right now?
Can I just add a question to that last piece, which
Please,
is
yeah.
the question of education? Because if you go to Niger or Mali or Maiduguri, virtually everybody says, for a long-term solution, the solution must be education.
Yep.
And you detail in your book how kind of the failure of education reform and then antipathy towards Western style education kind of helped fuel this whole thing. So where do you see kind of education or critical thinking fitting into that? If you ask people, what would be your quote unquote CVE priority? People say education. It doesn't mean Western values necessarily, but.
Yeah. I guess I'm going to see how much trouble I can get myself into. I think education is I think education is tremendously important. I have a PhD, right? I don't take it as, and most of my family has PhDs, so it's not something I take lightly. But I think it's a cop-out a lot of the times in politics. I think it's a cop-out in the United States. Because a lot of times we say, okay, we're going to educate the next generation, there's going to be more opportunity and so forth. But the real question, if you want to make a broad-based sort of social intervention, the question should be jobs, right? What are you training people to do? And, as has been seen around the world, the graduate who can't find a job is a politically destabilizing person, because you've raised that person's expectations, and then if you give them nothing. So I think education and then what, right? Education in isolation, I think, of course I want every child in the world to receive the best possible education, that they can, but in terms of politics, right, the question is, what are those people going to do as adults? So for me, with sort of CVE, and I guess I'm uncomfortable with CVE generally, maybe because of this issue of why are you trying to shape the attitudes of people who haven't committed violence yet, right? The question, again, for me is committed violence.
Like the term.
Thank you. Sir, there.
Thank you. I'm Leon Weintraub, retired Foreign Service. I was surprised you didn't speak about the historical centers of Islamic influence in Nigeria, Katsina, Sokoto, Kaduna, others. What has been their reaction to this? Do they see it in isolation? Do they see it as a threat to their influence? Or are they simply riding the tiger and hope it's not going to harm them. They're pretty influential in the country. How are they responded?
Yeah, I mean, excellent question, and thank you for it. So, I mean, one thing to say is that I think Boko Haram emerged in part because of changes and ruptures in the religious field. So I think that, I mean, the hereditary Muslim rulers across the northern part of the country still have a tremendous amount of influence. But I think that their influence has been increasingly challenged in recent years, and that somebody like Mohammed Yusuf was able to take advantage of, some of that challenge to them. One challenge to them has just been the sheer scale of urbanization, right? So the kinds of surveillance networks that they had in the past, and I've drawn heavily on an article by Murray Last in this context called The Search for Security in Northern Nigeria, and he makes this kind of basic point where he says, through the colonial period, maybe even into the early post-colonial period, if you were the emir, could have a network of basically informants and subordinates who would be able to tell you, I mean, and maybe he exaggerates a little bit, but who would be able to tell you where everybody slept last night, right? I mean, past a certain kind of level of population, that's just logistically impossible. So I think you have kind of urbanization disrupting that. You also have the rise of different, theological currents. I mean, in particular, Salafism, which posed all kinds of explicit, religiously framed challenges to those leaders' authority. So that's part of the background. In terms of how they've reacted to the crisis itself, I think, for one thing, there was a surprising amount of unanimity that I found when looking back through the historical record that killing Mohammed Yusuf had been a good idea. I was sort of surprised and even dismayed to see statements from prominent people, religious leaders, even across the religious spectrum, the Muslim spectrum, Salafis, Sufis, et cetera, saying it's a good thing that they killed this guy. And I think that was a real mistake, frankly, and the voices of scholars, Muslim scholars questioning that decision were from sort of what I would call the middle tier, of people, but the top tier seemed to be in pretty wide agreement that it had been a good thing. Then as the crisis wore on, I think people were frightened, and they, even some of the major religious leaders, I think, were frightened because they knew that they could be targets, because Boko Haram would deliberately target and kill people who criticized it, be it hereditary rulers or Salafis, even people who were very close to them theologically. If they criticized Boko Haram, they could be killed, by the movement, and they would, they kidnapped an emir, at least one emir at one point. They tried to assassinate the emir, both emirs of Kano, the late emir and the current emir, So, and I think that created an atmosphere of kind of intimidation and so forth. I remember being at a conference in Kano in late 2011. There was a conference that was about Boko Haram, but it was euphemistically called like youth and peace building or something, right? And so everybody was talking about Boko Haram without saying the words Boko Haram. And they even had the Sultan of Sokoto, who's, the preeminent, as you know, the preeminent hereditary Muslim ruler in the entire north. And even he, to my memory, didn't say the words Boko Haram, right? So I think that this atmosphere of intimidation, really played on them. Then they're kind of in a bind, overall, because, they have, they have a relationship with the political authorities, and the political authorities can play a big role in naming them and sustaining them in power. There have been instances, in the 1990s, a military ruler just deposed the Sultan of Sokoto, So, they need to get along with the political authorities sometimes, but then, of course, that can weaken and undermine their own, credibility vis-a-vis their followers. So I think that the Boko Haram crisis, in a way, has not just been the direct challenge of Boko Haram, it's also revealed maybe some of the longer term challenges that they face. And maybe this comes back to the question of, what comes next? Because if their power gets shakier over time, then what are the repercussions of that for the broader society? I don't want to sound like too much of a pessimist, though. I don't expect Nigeria to collapse. I don't expect, but I do expect that there will be at least pockets of conflict in the future.
You have time for one more question. Sir?
So I think one of the key issues in looking for a solution is to understand where the problem is today. And I think that Boko Haram has the capacity to morph and to change and to seek new alliances and to become, at various times, it's been more of a criminal organization. And obviously at times we look at it's very important to understand its religious lineage, but there's also its kind of connection to the criminal underworld and its ability to, part of its tenacity, I would argue, is its connections to smuggling networks, even human trafficking, to other countries in Africa, like, well, Cameroon, Sudan, even South Africa, where there are kind of a broader sort of network. And I also think that's where part of the Kanuri issue also becomes important. If you're looking for communities where there's sort of criminal relationships and links and chains. The reason why I'm saying that is you mentioned, people look at it's either the military or the political that's going to be the solution, but in fact there's a very strong component in which law enforcement actually becomes part of the solution to the problem. And that means seeing it in a slightly different way and understanding that there's a role to play for those countries as well, where the connection is both in terms of providing finances, providing weaponry, and longer sort of chains and links of smuggling. And that's very much to do with the nature of the beast. What is Boko Haram today has been pushed to the margins of Sambisa Forest, Lake Chad, Niger area. What is it and in its kind of current iteration? And I think it's much more in many ways of a criminal network and needs to be tackled and as such. And I think that gives one a hope of a different kind of solution as well.
Thank you.
Well, thanks. It's a set of excellent points. And it goes back to broader debates about jihadist movements in general, right? Whether they're ideological, whether they're political, or whether they're more criminal and so forth. I should say that in the book, I tried to be basically as conservative as I could in the use of evidence, and where possible to provide as much documentary evidence as I could for the claims that I was making. I think that necessarily makes the book's treatment of these kind of financial aspects maybe one of the weaker parts of the book, honestly, because the kind of documentary trail for getting at some of the dynamics that you're talking about is just not as strong as for other aspects. One thing I would say, to add to what you said, is that well before Boko Haram came along in Nigeria and in Cameroon in particular, in northeastern Nigeria and northern Cameroon, you had a lot of complaints about banditry, right? Banditry, by local officials, and then you had equally kind of serious charges of complicity, even charges, in Cameroon of complicity between hereditary rulers there and bandits and so forth. So, in a way, some of these problems of criminality that you're talking about really predate Boko Haram and will probably post-date Boko Haram as well. And I agree, too, with what you said, that sort of a set of law enforcement tools and so forth is needed. And I think there, too, maybe there we do get back. In general, I see kind of a minimal role for the United States in a lot of this. But I think one thing that the United States should think about in general is the circulation of small arms throughout the world, which we have played a role in accelerating. And if there were fewer small arms circulating in the world, maybe some of these problems would be less severe.
All right, thank you. Well, I think we actually run
Happy
over
to talk
over time. Yeah, but please, feel free to approach any of the panelists. But I want to be considerate of everyone's time. I'd just like to join the chorus of praise for Alexander's new book and suggest that you all go out and buy a copy outside. We've got a bookseller there. Thank you all so much for coming out. It's been a real pleasure.